Hello everyone, I'm Captain Logan, and tonight I'm going to do a special video about tropes in CW shows that I haven't thought about in a real long time. Bad tropes that I find amusing and that stuck with me after all of these years. This was an idea that came from Logan Dodd on the Captain Logan Show back on Thursday, if you're wondering where this came from, like AMC Comics in the comments there, and why I'm suddenly doing this out of nowhere. I did a little bit of a contest on the Captain Logan Show, last week, and said, and this was in the title, the best question gets its own show, and tonight is that show. I thought I'd go ahead and just knock it out while I was thinking about it, and this didn't go exactly the way I expected it to. I thought I would end up running with a really kind of thought-provoking question that I just wanted to spend a lot more time on than I had in the Captain Logan Show. And I had a lot of those, and they were, I found myself noodling them so hard in the moment that I kind of said everything that I probably had to say about them and spent far too long in the Captain Logan Show on them that I probably should have, and just should have made one its own video. But see, I would have had to have picked one of those and then still given a half-decent answer for each of the rest of them. So the way it ended up going instead was somebody brought up a list that in the moment I went, I don't think I can come up with as interesting of a list and as fun of entries as I could if I had a few minutes to write them down ahead of time. And so that's why I ended up going with tropes in CW shows. So instead of 5, as Logan Dodd asked for, I came up with 10, and I'm just going to run through them and tell you what I came up with. And I don't know how long we'll be talking about this, but this is not necessarily, and I always say this, I always say I'm not going to go very long, and then I end up talking for an hour. I don't know how long this video will be, but this won't necessarily be a video that I had to make apart from the Captain Logan Show because I had just too much to say, so much as I needed more time to prepare for it than I had in the Captain Logan Show. So let me preface this by saying I haven't thought about these shows, most of them, in a long time, and I haven't watched them in even longer. The last thing I watched with any of these really was Crisis on Infinite Earths. I was already not real into these and had pretty much checked out before that, and then after that I was really done and not interested in really jumping back in. I watched, I think, the half a season of Flash that was on up until that point, and thought that show was actually better than it had been the last time I had checked into that, but I heard it went downhill after that, and I couldn't get excited about getting back into that either, even though that season seemed better, because the whole thing was building up to, oh, Barry's gonna die, and then, spoiler alert, but you see Crisis, and he's supposed to, allegedly, and then that doesn't happen, and so it kind of makes that whole season seem really pointless, because the whole thing is him kind of just getting his affairs in order, and then I'd have to go back and watch a whole rest of the season where, like, psych. Not that I expected him to die, obviously, it's his show, but it wasn't handled great. Everything about Crisis was, of course, not handled great. So, I say all that to say, and I guess also I saw a couple episodes of Legends I had never seen before, because for no good reason other than I thought it might be fun to put it on and talk over it. Austin and I did a mini marathon a few months ago on that show, so I saw the bowling episode and a couple other things that I hadn't seen before that were later episodes, so I guess I did that and kind of checked into that show, but that was real, half-hearted. We were talking over it, so I wasn't really giving it, entirely its fair shake. I mean, I did the best I could, but it was, but that was kind of more of an exercise in riffing and just doing, blind commentary. So I say that to say, if I did this a few years ago, I'm sure there are things that would be fresh in my mind that I would want to talk about that I'm not bringing up tonight. So this is just going on several years old memory, and maybe one of these days I'll go back and rewatch some of the better stuff and maybe catch up and see everything I missed just to say I've seen all of it. I don't know if that's good for my brain or not, but there's a part of me that is curious about some of it to see what happened with some things. I don't know if I could stomach a lot more Supergirl, because that show had gotten just so pandery, which sucks because I think the first season of that was better than a lot of these shows. And people also have been asking me lately about Superman and Lois, which kind of counts as one of these, but has really gone its own way and ignored a lot of this stuff, and has been able to do that canonically because it's post-crisis, which is nice. But like Diggle shows up in the first season, and like it knows its roots, it's connected to that stuff, but you certainly don't have to have ever seen that, and it's a lot like Strange New Worlds, actually, where, like, you know, it's a Discovery spinoff, but it kind of almost doesn't matter that it is. So I will definitely get back to that at some point, and maybe check in a video if I get around to it. But anyway, here comes my, I don't even want to see my 10 most favorite, but just 10 bad CW tropes that I thought of that I always kind of made me laugh, or I was perplexed by, or I just couldn't even believe they did. Thanks for watching live if you jumped in. And, AMC just now asked about Superman and Lois, so I'm glad that I said that. Real quick before I do this, Busted Sim, Arrow got me back into watching currently airing TV, which is interesting because that was, of course, a decade ago now, nearly. Can you believe that? The 10th anniversary of Arrow will be next year. We just had the 20th anniversary of Smallville last year. I stuck around with all those shows and all of the crossovers because of that loyalty. Once it was done, I lost interest. Wow, interesting. Okay, so here we go. My first trope is referencing the cheesy intro voiceover in episode. This got more egregious as it went along. We got to a point where, and the shows got really cutesy and degenerated into self-parody very quickly, but we got to a point where it seemed like every other episode, and Arrow was probably more at fault with this than anything, but Flash did it too. It seemed like every other episode you had Oliver Queen saying something that he says in that voiceover. And then we also did a lot of just repeating that first season line, you have failed this city. That gets said constantly, and I had to kind of keep reminding myself that that wasn't part of the voiceover because we heard it so much. And I don't know, it always felt like a weird meta thing. It was like the show has to, like the characters in the show, it's like they've read the thing that Oliver says at the beginning, but there's no in-story context for that. So like, why is he doing that? It's just kind of forcing it into the writing. It was very silly, but the big thing he would always say is, I have to become something else. I have to become someone else, and that came up a lot. Okay, and then my next trope is, so we're too good for this comic book stuff. Again, especially at the beginning of Arrow. Oh wait, people like that stuff. Let's intrusively include it retroactively. Again, Arrow is probably the biggest, the most at fault for this, the biggest culprit for this, but this drove me mad from the beginning of that show, and that it just got more compounded when we kept kind of going backwards with it. Like, it'd be one thing, it felt like a lot of change for the sake of change for no good reason, just a lot of too cool for school kind of stuff, and even beyond, actual Green Arrow fans going, wait a minute, this guy isn't Oliver Queen, this is just Bruce Wayne, and you just made this show because the Nolan movies are done and you want to capitalize on the popularity of that, which is why we've got so much Batman stuff from the beginning, like with Ra's al Ghul, etc. But even beyond that, you had things like, the show's got to be called Arrow. He can't have his own superhero name from the beginning because it's not realistic enough. And yes, this was a more grounded show than Flash would become, and it was a, darker, more serious show than they got as they went along, and they embraced the comic book stuff, and in some ways they embraced it wrong. I don't want to say too much, just they ran away with themselves, and again it became kind of a self-parody thing, but early on it was kind of a holdover from the Smallville days, where it's gonna be based on this material, but it's not really gonna be a superhero show. And like, I will give them, Arrow absolutely was a superhero show. Don't get me wrong, but it seemed like they were afraid of losing, or not being able to gain enough of an audience in the first place. So they're like, Green Arrow sounds hokey, so we'll just call it Arrow. And then its spinoff is just The Flash. We didn't even try with that. Like already, and I'm glad they were learning, but like it just looks sillier going backwards, I guess. So it's got to be called The Hood early on, and then he's the Arrow, and then later he'll just straight up call himself Green Arrow. One of the weirdest ones is Starling City, that it's supposed to be Star City, or it is in the comics, and then they changed it to Starling City for no good reason. Okay, fine, whatever. I don't know that we never needed like an in-universe way to change it back. Again, it felt like, I guess people are fine with this comic book stuff, so we'll come up with an excuse to change it to Star City. That was strange, and then the arbitrary choice to call Dinah Lance Laurel Lance. This is one of the weirder ones, where then years later, we'll do a new Black Canary even after Laurel. We'll have our third Black Canary, and we'll bring in a character that just happens to have the name Dinah, so that fans will feel like we're doing things more authentic to comics. That was always very strange. Okay, my third trope. Let's change the rules for time travel whenever it's convenient, but make two of our shows all about time travel. I'm not going to get in the weeds with this again because I spent hours upon hours complaining about this and trying to understand the time travel rules in the Arrowverse, and there aren't any, but it pretends like there are, or there kind of are initially, and then we just keep again changing it for the sake of whatever story we're wanting to tell. So like, I like the first season of Flash a lot, for the most part, up until that last episode, and then that finale really breaks the whole thing where it's pretty consistent about how its time travel worked, and then it does not make sense at that point. And then you get into Legends, and it's on a whole other level of, we don't have an internal logic for this, but we're pretending like we do. And the whole excuse of it takes time for time to change, that's obnoxious. Like, maybe don't make so much of what you're making about time travel if you're not going to be remotely consistent about it. As I've always said, time travel is a conceit in the first place. Sometimes when I complain about this, people will go, well, Cap, time travel never makes any sense. Yeah, but like with anything, time travel is like magic. Like with anything made up like that, it doesn't matter if there would have to be paradoxes, and it's going to break your brain if you think about it too much. Like, at some point, you have to basically just throw your hands in the air and go, we want to tell a time travel story, so we have time travel, and like, if you take it to its farthest conclusion, it may not work, but you have to be as consistent as you can with it. You have to have an initial set of rules, and they're going to be arbitrary to some degree, but just like, this is by and large how it's supposed to work, and you have to hold to those, because if you don't, it's entirely arbitrary, and it's impossible for your audience to feel anything about the stakes and the characters involved. That's why that matters. We have our own, this is my fifth trope, we have our own Batman and Superman in Arrow and Flash, but then later on we just can't get away from Batman and Superman. Some of you guys will remember me saying this years and years ago when, and keep in mind that Supergirl wasn't initially even a CW show. Of course, once it went to that network, it became much, much more like those shows. But I never wanted Supergirl to be related to Superman, especially once it got roped into that, I guess, multiverse, because up until Crisis, it wasn't actually in the same world. But I always thought it would have been really nice if Supergirl could have just been that world's version of Superman and not be tied to him at all. And considering how hard it was pushing, like, look how modern and hip and progressive we are, that would have been a risk that would have been really gutsy, and I think they really should have taken. And partly, that's part of the reason that we can't get away from Superman in those shows. And then ultimately, we actually end up adding Superman, and thank goodness we did, don't get me wrong, because Superman and Lois is actually a pretty good show, and the actor they got to play him is excellent, and credit where credit's due, they really understand the morality and the basic tenets of what Superman is all about, even from the beginning of Supergirl, in a way that I don't think Snyder and the DCEU really did. And so we kind of needed that right then, if only it hadn't been as insulting and pandery once we got past that first season. But then now Superman and Lois is a thing that, regardless of how many people are watching, I think we really kind of need right now. But I digress. With the CW, with the Arrowverse, which I guess they tried to stop calling the Arrowverse, but that didn't take. Even after that show ended, everybody still calls it that. The 5 people that still talk about that. From the beginning, or at least after you had Flash, there was a real clear attempt to say, okay, we're not really allowed to use Superman and Batman in these shows. So we have these kind of stand-ins with kind of avatars with Arrow and Flash. And from the beginning, again, with Arrow, it kind of wanted to be a Batman show anyway. So once we brought in Flash, we had this massive comparison-contrast thing where we have the pessimist and the optimist. We have the guy who's a little bit more ends-based in his ethics, and then we have the guy who's a little bit more virtue-based in his ethics. I'm pretty sure their first crossover is called World's Finest before we even have references to Superman and Batman. I may not be remembering that right, but it was pretty clear that that's what they wanted that to be. And as it goes on, they've got to find ways to keep shoving in Batman and Superman stuff. And some of it's not their fault. Some of it's that they were allowed to later in a way they weren't earlier on, but maybe they should have left Supergirl as, in its own universe. I know it took a long time before they finally integrated it, and it was, I thought, kind of weird that they didn't do it in the first place, but the more I'm thinking about it now, the more I'm like, I really kind of liked that Flash and Arrow or their Superman and Batman. I kind of wish they could have just hung on to that. And then once we got to Batwoman, it got really silly because we had a Superman, but we couldn't put a Batman on screen, and so once again, just like with the old Birds of Prey show from the early 2000s, we had to come up with a spin-off to a Batman we never saw and just find some way to kind of get him off screen, and it was just all really awkward. And so we have one Batman on screen in those shows, and it's in the Crisis crossover, and it's one of the most embarrassing things they did, one of the most cynical things they did too, as cool as it was to see Kevin Conroy come in and play Kingdom Come Batman. Okay, so there's 5, but I want to do, or is that 5, or is that just 4? 1, 2, 3, no, that was just 4. Pardon me, I can't count. Here's my 5th one. We crammed, and I did mention this one the other night, we crammed the first season with everything we wanted to adapt from comics and everything we had to say with a character. Let's keep it going 6 or 7 more years. Almost all of these shows watched like there was a fear they would get canceled right after the first season, even though it's CW, and after Arrow, it should have been real clear that if a show got any kind of ratings, that probably wasn't going to happen. So I don't think that was really the motivation, but it's almost like the showrunners got, and again, credit where it's due, the first season is the best, or one of the best for most of these shows. I think it's that way for Supergirl, though I haven't watched most of that show, so that might not be fair. Maybe it gets better. I haven't heard that it doesn't. But I think as a whole season, that's true with Arrow, but the first half of the second season is better than all of that first season, I think, but for an entire season, because it gets too convoluted and kind of falls apart in the second half. But I don't know about Legends. I don't think that show's good anywhere I've seen it, really. But anyway, I think that there's this, again, credit where it's due, there was this excitement, it seemed like, for each of these shows from the producers in some of the stuff that they got to adapt, and an attempt to make it, kind of an exciting event to get to, especially once we got to Flash, to get to do real superhero television. Because keep in mind that now these shows are a dime a dozen, but back in 2013, we hadn't had very many, and it was a big deal to get not just stuff based on comics, but characters actually in costumes, and some pretty good stunt work and stuff. These shows look cheaper as they go along. Early on, there was a lot of real effort put into these shows at every stage, on every level. And I felt like, and I worried about this just watching the seasons before we got to the second and third and fourth. So much happens in the first season of Flash. It feels a lot like Aquaman would as a movie later, where it's like, is there anything left to do? Look at all the stuff you guys have adapted already, and yeah, there's more content to potentially go to, but it always felt like we. And I think maybe the part of the problem was having so many episodes. You had 22, 24 episodes where we just got kind of ahead of ourselves and a little too ambitious. And I think there was an attempt to not have too many throwaway episodes and stuff, or at least, because there are a lot of throwaway episodes, maybe I should say more just having enough episodes where we're actually adapting stuff from comics. And then you get into the second season, it's like, after the kind of multiverse shattering or potentially shattering thing that happens in the first season, like, where do you go from there? And yeah, it got pretty meandery and it got even more convoluted, and I think that's part of the reason that it starts looking more like self-parody as it goes along. So I mean, I guess I shouldn't say that's a favorite trope. That's an unfortunate trope, but it's one that I've been on about for a long time. This is one that I know a lot of people will agree with me on, and some of these are going to have to be more about a particular show than the others, of course, but it's a trope because there's a pattern. It happens more than twice. Flash villains are not allowed to be villains. And I guess this actually isn't just Flash, because Legends is what really did this to the Flash villains more than anything. But it starts out with Killer Frost, where we go, for seemingly no good reason, here's a character who is destined to become a villain, maybe. And she's got she's going to develop ice powers, and then she's gonna meet like she's just one of the two kind of scientist characters in a chair that tell Barry where to go, and you'd think that maybe it would be a Lex Luthor thing where you'd watch her develop into a villain. It's not really what happened. It's almost like we didn't really want her to be a villain for some reason. I never understood the motivation from the producers on this, and what is it? Caitlin Snow, is that her name? I forget now. Again, it's been a long time since I've watched these shows. But it seemed like the idea was, well, we know she's supposed to be a villain, so we'll kind of tease you with it, but we don't actually really want to do that. Sometimes with these things, it felt like we like these actors too much, and we don't want to make them do things they don't want to do, or we like them in the roles we have them, so we're going to keep them there. Or sometimes it would be the Felicity Smoke problem of, the fans really like this character, let's really blow her up and do too much with her. But with Killer Frost, it was just bizarre because she meets a counterpart of hers from another universe who is evil, and then later, I'm pretty sure independent from that, ends up developing, or is it related to that? I forget, because we had kind of a multiverse traveling version of her that was evil, that was Killer Frost, and she just went by that name as her name. But then she also developed an alternate personality that was her, and I think that was unrelated, but I don't remember for sure. But then you also had this with, people have always complained about this with the Rogues, where you never really had the Rogues in Flash, and maybe at this point they've finally kind of tried to do it. I'm not sure, but I know Dan, when he was watching this show, would complain about this a lot, and a lot of Flash fans did, where you had Rory, Heatwave, who was a villain for an episode or two, and then they just made him a hero on Legends, and they kind of played him like an anti-hero, but he was basically just like a bad boy with a good heart, I guess. And then you had the same thing with what's his name, Captain Cold, and I loved their Captain Cold. I actually liked both of those guys, but they got more ridiculous as it went along, because they started realizing that they started off not just playing cartoon characters, like over-the-top comic characters, certainly, but not just cartoon characters. And then they realized, we're just in a cartoon, so we'll play it like we're in Schumacher's Batman and Robin. And, so that was a trope specifically for the Flash corner of that universe. And then kind of like that, again, for one particular corner of this or one particular show, Supergirl characters with comic names for no in-universe reason. This didn't happen a lot, and maybe there aren't more than 2 of these. I can think of 2, but I've made fun of this so much I had to put this on the list because it really cracks me up. The 2 I thought of are, we've got Cyborg Superman, who, I've talked about this a lot, but I still can't get around it. I still can't get my mind around it. He calls himself Cyborg Superman, even though he doesn't look anything like Superman whatsoever, and he has no relation to Superman, and he's not wearing a Superman costume. He just goes, "I'm Cyborg Superman," and that's hilarious. And then, just as weird was Mon-El, because he was already called that when he came to Earth, even though he's not a Kryptonian and he's not related at all to Supergirl or the Els. He just had that name already. In the comics, he is named that by Supergirl, I think, and it's kind of just like an affectionate way to say you're part of the family, and they never talk about it in the show. There's no explanation, and nobody thinks it's weird. And I think they date, too. And, like, they sound like they have the same last name. But I guess his name isn't Mon-El. He's just, I mean, maybe that's how it's actually supposed to be spelled, even in the show. But they talk about it like his name, like he has just a one-word name, like Madonna. He's just Mon-El, as opposed to Kara Zor-El. I don't know. It's weird. And then this was became a real famous one with Arrow, which was sad because it seemed like they were trying so hard to avoid it early on. It was relatively realistic and believable about this until it wasn't. Oliver had to train for 5 years on an island to be a great fighter. And then everybody he's friends with is as good as him after like a month or less on the job. And the most egregious of this, of course, was Laurel, who just didn't seem like a character that would ever be a vigilante and ever be any good at that. And yes, she trained, and I forget with whom. I forget that guy's name. But there was and he's comic book. There's a boxing guy. It wasn't. I can't remember his name now. But anyway, but like not enough to be able to do to get away with some of the stuff she did. And it was funny because I don't think that actress ever thought she was going to be Black Canary, because early on, she would get asked this a lot in interviews, and interviewers would be like, so when are you going to take up the mantle? Because, like, Sarah Lance is Black Canary, but you're supposed to be the real Black Canary. And she goes, well, they're taking my character in a very different direction. And then eventually she's just Black Canary, and it was completely unbelievable. And we did this with his sister and with everybody in that show. And too many archers as good as he is that haven't spent as long getting good at that. Okay, couple more. My 9th trope. Here's a cool character, but then you have to live with a way less interesting or more obnoxious character taking up their mantle for a lot longer than you spent with the originals. So a couple examples, I kind of just alluded to it. You get it with Black Canary. Sarah Lance is amazing, and then Laurel's going to take up the mantle, and she's going to be Black Canary for a lot longer. And then when we kill her off, we're going to treat it like a, spoilers everywhere for this show, we're going to treat it like a much bigger deal than when Sarah died. Maybe that's not fair. I guess it was a big deal when Sarah died, and of course we resurrected her right away, and Laurel we didn't, although, and I'm going off on a different tangent here, but one trope I almost put in was characters are not allowed to stay dead, and that's not entirely accurate. It's kind of more, actors aren't allowed to leave the show, because more often what we would do is we would kill somebody off, and then we would either bring them back really easily and really quickly and like faster than comic book time, like we did with Sarah, and then who was my favorite character in that show, and then they turned her into a kind of a different character after she was resurrected. But then what we did more often is we would kill a character and then we would come up with an excuse for the actor to keep playing somebody different. And very often it was an alternate universe version of them that we would contrive some way to just keep them around. So we had that running gag where Wells in Flash had to be had to be there every season, but he's a different version of Wells every time, which is kind of an amusing joke, I guess. On the surface of it, it got really old, and I didn't care about any of them after that first one. And he was a really cool character, and so it was, I don't know, I never liked that they did that. But you had that with, like I said, Black Canary, where Laurel takes up the mantle, and then you have that third Black Canary who's there maybe even longer, I guess a couple years, but Sarah Lance didn't get to be Black Canary as long as they did, and I didn't like them as well, obviously. I mentioned Wells. Firestorm kind of also has this. I don't mind the main Firestorm duo, but I thought Ronnie was really well cast and really cool, and we didn't get to spend a lot of time with him because he's presumed dead when we first meet him, and then of course he does come back and he's around a little bit, but again, just a way cooler version, or cooler Firestorm than we actually ended up getting to hang out with for the most of those shows. And then finally, and this is what I used to complain about all the time when we reviewed these shows, killing people makes you a dangerous vigilante. Even though we go back and forth constantly and regress Oliver's character in trying to decide whether it's okay if he kills people. But I digress. Killing people makes you a dangerous vigilante, but real heroes can have their own private prisons, which we did with Flash, and I think we kind of did it with Supergirl, although that was at least like an underground government installation, and so they're doing kind of, you know, shadow government stuff in the first place, so that's more a complaint with Flash than with anything else. But anyway, so there's 10 tropes, half an hour for you. I'll see what the comments are saying, and then I'll bid everybody adieu. Wildcat was his name. That was the guy who was training Laurel Lance to be Black Canary. Thanks very much. Bless Sim Cat Grant, who's different from Cat Grant and Supergirl. Well, yeah, that is true. I'm not sure why you mentioned that. Sorry. Dagon Spear, I think I read the actress thought she was outright primed to go forward as Black Canary. I mean, I would have thought that, but like I said, I read interviews with her where she seemed to keep sidestepping it, where she's like, well, we're doing different things. And Laurel was really unfortunate because I thought they went out of their way that first season to make her as sympathetic as possible, and I actually liked that character. And then she got more and more typical whiny, unsympathetic love interest as it went along. You notice I didn't put in a trope at all about those. I thought about it, but I just didn't come up with a great way to articulate that, and I had 10 already, so I ended up not going there. But I kind of wanted to put in something about love interest characters that have to be angry with the protagonist for no good reason, just to create drama, all the way to the point where sometimes we couldn't even hide the fact that it was for no good reason. There's an episode with, this is infamous now, with Felicity, where she's really mad at Oliver because he hid information from her that might have gotten his kid killed, and she breaks up with him. If memory serves, this is what happened, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I think she leaves him over a technicality. It's not just that she's mad at him, like, she's done. And she's like, well, I can't be with somebody that lies to me. And he's like, well, it was an ultimatum. Like, you know, a bad guy had me over a barrel. My kid was going to get killed if anybody knew about this. And she's like, I totally understand. Of course you had to do that. I can't be with you anymore. And I mean, the writers might as well have just come right out and put an intertitle on the screen that said, this is what love interests are supposed to do. We're not, like, ever since Joss Whedon, we're not allowed to have characters stay together and stay happy at all, and we can't contrive more believable, realistic drama between characters, even though uh, like perfectly reasonable people every day have difficulties with their spouses and spouse with their spouses and don't necessarily break up over them. And I know some of you guys are probably already jumping to your keyboards to write, yeah, but they kept they kept the couple in Flash together with Iris and Barry, and yeah, that's the token one, and that also had a lot of this. Like, she was sometimes, I don't want to say just as awful as Felicity, but she would have that as well, certainly. AMC, I thought for sure Cap would put the love interest walking off angry after having an argument. Yeah, like I said, I kicked around putting that on there, and that goes all the way back to Smallville. Most of the things I came up with were much more about the Arrowverse than anything outside of it or that begins in Smallville, because I was just kind of in that mode thinking about that, because I figured Logan Dodd was thinking Arrowverse when he said CW tropes. Tyler Overall, hi. Superhero stuff has a real problem with making the love interest character completely unsympathetic just to create some form of tension. It's like these writers don't often see women as real people. Yeah, and it's a tough balancing act, right? Because there's nothing wrong with, and you have to do this, I think, with having characters that are there to serve a protagonist as opposed to being an end unto themselves. So it isn't sexist to have a love interest character that's there to be the, whether it's male or female, the superhero's love interest. That doesn't automatically mean that they don't act like a real person. When you have a singular character drama versus, and these days a lot of TV shows don't seem to understand the difference and don't know how to do this, versus an ensemble cast. These days, so many things have to be ensemble, even if it's one person's name in the title. There's a difference between a supporting cast and an ensemble cast, right? In a supporting cast, all those characters are there to serve the protagonist narratively, and that doesn't mean that you can't come up with ways to create tension and to create friction between your love interest and the main character without having to throw one or both of them under the bus. Tyler, the Raimi Spider-Man movies have it a bit. They have it a lot, in my opinion, but it's somewhat understandable there. It's terrible in the Fantastic Four movies. I think it's overall probably worse, especially in that second Fantastic Four movie, than the Raimi Spider-Man movies. But just keep in mind that the writers, especially the writers of that second one, were the same people writing Smallville, and it really showed with the way that they were handling Mary Jane. Chewbacca's Lover, in your Marvel Mania for the Tim Story Fantastic Four, you talk about how you could do the effects and action series on CW now. Action scenes, pardon me. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I don't remember saying that, but I agree with myself, absolutely. The CW, like I said, got cheaper as it went along, and some of that was probably depletion of funds. I'm sure if you went and looked at the numbers, if they're even published, you'd see a lot of those shows get less money as they go along, but I still think that they could have been a lot smarter in how they used that money, because I was blown away by each of the first seasons of those shows, maybe even Legends, but particularly Flash and Arrow, and I realize Supergirl was on a different network, but Supergirl as well, in how far we had come with TV special effects, and how there were scenes with a lot of CG that maybe you could tell it was CG, but it looked as integrated as it might in a movie, or much more so than it might have, even a couple of years before that. And as it went along, it seemed like we just got less strategic in how we presented it. So you'd have stuff in broad daylight that just looked absolutely horrible, that you're like, why didn't you put that in shadow? I don't understand. Flash looked with, like, the running effects were always really good, and it had more, full-on CG creatures, of course. because I mean, I guess first season of Arrow probably didn't have any of that, but they were making like a real heavy special effects show in a way that Arrow, at least early on, wasn't. And I was really dismayed by how well all that stuff looked. Supergirl got more ambitious, where they had to have like a fully CG character in Martian Manhunter. But again, for TV, that looked really good. And then as it went along, everything just got cheaper and cheaper. And I think they could have hit it better than they did. Well, folks, I'm going to go ahead and bid everybody farewell. I just wanted to go ahead and do this video because I promised that I would, and I had a few minutes here to go ahead and knock it out. So there are 10 tropes that came to mind from shows I've not looked at in a long time, and a lot of stuff was kind of coming back to me as I was reminiscing and also kind of grimacing a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had with these shows. There's a nostalgia I have for some of this, certainly, and sometimes I think about, kind of like with Spawn, when I was doing Spawn year, sometimes I'll think about going back and looking at some of this again, and then I'll remember how much it kind of broke my brain and was, you know, kind of like eating too many nachos, where it just was kind of junk food, not real great for me, and it might be okay to go back and look at an episode or two, but maybe I shouldn't, you know, binge it again. I was doing that with Smallville again over Christmas, and that was a bad idea. It kind of lowers your standards, but more than that, it just makes it difficult to like put sentences together because you don't because you're not like looking at real people being people. It's again, it's just not the best for your brain, but I miss some of it, and I also wonder if I shouldn't check into some of those shows that I haven't really bothered with. Like, I watched the pilot of Stargirl, and I heard really good things about the rest of it, but I haven't watched any more of that, and maybe I'll go back and look at that. Sometimes I'll avoid them, because I know I don't have time to necessarily sit down and do a coherent, like, full-season overview, so I'll go, well, I don't want to watch this, because I'm going to want to review it, and then I may not have time to, because some of these things I can get away with doing one watch of and talking about, and some of them I need to do a couple of watches, and so I'll go, well, I'm going to want to talk about this if I watch it, and I don't know if I have time to do that, so then I'll kind of avoid it. So there's a lot of shows I haven't looked at just because I'm afraid that I'm not going to have a chance to really weigh in on them, but maybe I should just bite the bullet and, you know, knock some of that stuff out at some point. Anyway, thanks again for watching, everybody. Really appreciate you, whether you came in live or watched after the fact. You guys are always great, and if all goes according to plan, I will be back. I actually got to go plan for this video right now. I'm going to be back tomorrow night with a new episode of Superhero Rewind. I am not reviewing a movie tomorrow night, but I'm going to be talking about merchandising with superhero movies and a very specific aspect of that. We're going to look at the backs of several DVD and Blu-ray boxes from well in the past and much more recently, and see how those movies were sold by synopsis or lack thereof, and there's some real fun stuff and some real kind of interesting choices. So we're going to be talking about that tomorrow night, 10 o'clock Central Time, and I'll let you know if for some reason that doesn't work out, but that's the plan right now. And then I'll be back again Tuesday for another request. Thanks a lot for watching, everybody, and I'll see you again real soon.